The marble corridor echoed with the rapid, rhythmic strike of heels against stone. Astra moved with a singular, desperate velocity, cutting through the morning rush of the office floor. Her left hand gripped a phone pressed tight against her ear, the screen glowing. In her right, a thick stack of files threatened to slide from her grasp with every sharp turn she took. She navigated the narrow space, her focus locked entirely on the elevator bank at the far end of the hall. A colleague stepped out from a side office, directly into her path. Astra swerved, her shoulder brushing the wall, her momentum barely dipping as she corrected her course. She did not look back. The air in the corridor felt recycled, thin and heavy with the scent of ozone. Every muscle in her legs burned, yet she pushed harder, her breathing becoming a sharp, audible rasp in the quiet spaces. She reached the elevator doors, her fingers hovering over the call button, her chest rising and falling in jagged, uneven bursts. She was a machine, running at maximum capacity, vibrating with the force of the day. The elevator doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. Astra stepped into the small mirrored space, her reflection a blur of motion. Before the doors could close, a hand reached out to block them. Her assistant stood there, clutching a tablet, eyes wide with concern. He held out a schedule update, his voice low and urgent. Astra, the board meeting was moved up. You need to review these notes before you walk in. Astra did not take the tablet. She did not even look at the screen. She reached out and pressed the button for the top floor, her thumb hovering over the panel with aggressive precision. "I am fine," she snapped, her gaze fixed on the floor, numbers counting upward. "I have got this." She watched the assistant hesitate, his hand still gripping the edge of the door. She stepped forward, forcing him to retract his arm, and the door slammed shut, cutting off his protest. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the elevator wall. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. She gripped the stack of files until her knuckles turned white, staring at the closing gap as if she could force the day to bend to her will. The elevator doors opened to the main office floor. Astra stepped out, her pace unrelenting. She walked past the break room, where the scent of fresh coffee hung in the air, and did not break stride. Her stomach tightened, a sharp, empty ache that she ignored with practiced ease. She reached her desk and dropped the files, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet corner of the room. Her monitor flickered to life. She stared at the screen, her eyes tracing the lines of text without absorbing a single word. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She stood up, paced the length of her cubicle, and sat back down. The cycle repeated. Her breathing began to change. Each inhalation was short, shallow, and caught in the upper reaches of her chest. Her neck muscles corded with tension. She reached for a pen, but her grip faltered, and the instrument clattered against the desk. She sat motionless. The office lights overhead flickered, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with her erratic heartbeat. Astra looked up, squinting against the sudden intensity of the glare. The usual hum of the ventilation system and the distant chatter of colleagues began to bleed together, losing their distinct edges. Slowly, the sound morphed. It climbed in frequency, sharpening into a thin, high-pitched drone that vibrated behind her eyes. She pressed her palms against her ears, but the noise persisted, seemingly emanating from the very air around her. The office space began to shift. The distance between her desk and the exit felt like it was stretching, the perspective warping. The air grew heavy, thick with a static charge. She tried to focus on the objects on her desk, but the edges blurred. The room felt smaller, the walls inching closer. She reached out to steady herself, but the desk surface felt cold and unfamiliar. The drone reached a piercing crescendo, vibrating through the marrow of her bones. Astra stood frozen, her fingers locked in a rigid claw around the stack of files. Every muscle in her arm spasmed, a sudden violent reaction to the mounting pressure. Her grip, once iron-willed and precise, simply ceased to function. The files slipped. They did not fall in a neat pile. They exploded outward, sliding across the polished floor like dead leaves caught in a sudden gust of wind. Sheets of paper skittered into the dark corners of the cubicle, their edges curling against the baseboards. She watched them move, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if witnessing the disintegration of her own resolve. The silence that followed the clatter was more jarring than the drone had been. She stood amidst the scattered documents, her her hands still suspended in the air, trembling. The office floor, once a familiar landscape of productivity, now looked alien, littered with the debris of her failed attempt to maintain control. She looked down at her empty palms. The last tether to her routine had snapped. She did not reach down to retrieve them. She could not. The floor seemed to tilt, and she swayed, her balance failing. Astra remained motionless, the silence of the office pressing against her eardrums like deep water. The scattered papers lay motionless on the marble, a stark map of her sudden inertia. She tried to inhale, but the air felt thin, stripped of oxygen. Then, the sensation arrived. It started behind her ribs, a sharp, glacial cold that bloomed outward, anchoring itself deep within her chest. It was not a metaphor. It was a physical weight, heavy and dense, dragging her posture downward. Her heart hammered against this new, icy obstruction, each beat echoing with a dull, rhythmic thud. She reached out, her fingers finding the sharp edge of the mahogany desk. She gripped the wood, her knuckles whitening until the skin stretched taut over the bone. The cold weight intensified, spreading from her ribs into her shoulders, locking her joints in place. She leaned her entire body weight onto the desk, the polished surface biting into her palms. Every nerve ending in her torso screamed with the pressure of this internal collapse. She was no longer fighting the office or the work. She was fighting the sudden, undeniable gravity of her own dread. The desk groaned slightly under her grip, the only sound in the vast, empty room as she struggled to remain upright against the crushing, freezing reality settling deep inside her. The desk offered no stability. It felt like a raft in a rising tide. Astra stared at the wall, but the distance between her and the far partition began to shrink. The white paint seemed to ripple, moving inward with a slow, deliberate cadence. She blinked, trying to reset her vision, but the effect intensified. The ceiling lowered, the air grew thick and stagnant, and the corners of the room began to blur into a singular, encroaching gray. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts, each one failing to fill her lungs. The space around her was physically contracting, the structural integrity of the office bending to the weight of her internal collapse. She pushed away from the desk, but her legs felt heavy, unresponsive to her command. The walls were now inches from her periphery, a suffocating enclosure that left no room for movement or thought. She felt the pressure against her skin, her lips parted, the words escaping as a ragged, involuntary prayer. No, not again. The office was no longer a workspace. It was a gauntlet of eyes and noise. Astra abandoned the desk, her movements erratic and uncoordinated. She stumbled into the corridor, her shoulder grazing the hard plaster of the wall. Every sound, the distant clatter of a keyboard, the hum of the ventilation, the soft murmur of a colleague hit her like a physical blow. She kept her head down, hair shielding her face, focused entirely on the narrow strip of carpet ahead. Her lungs burned, demanding air she could not properly draw. She turned a corner, her pace quickening into a frantic, uneven gait. She needed a void. She needed a place where the walls were not closing in. Her hand found the cold metal handle of the storage room door. She shoved it open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut behind her. The lock clicked into place, a sharp, final sound that severed her from the outside world. She did not stand. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the vertical surface of the door, her body hitting the floor with a dull thud. She pulled her legs to her chest, pressing her back against the wood, finally hidden. The darkness of the small room was a relief, a cool, quiet sanctuary. The silence of the storage room was absolute, yet it did nothing to quiet the chaos inside her. Astra sat on the floor, her back pressed hard against the door, her knees drawn up to her chest. She buried her face in her hands, her fingers digging into her skin, trying to anchor herself to reality. Her breathing was a jagged, uneven rhythm that rattled in her throat. She felt the tears track hot paths down her cheeks. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, vibrating with the force of her internal collapse. She shook her head, a slow, rhythmic motion. "I thought I moved past this," she whispered, the words barely audible in the cramped space. She pulled her knees tighter. "Why am I back here?" The question hung in the air. She felt the weight of every effort she had made over the last few months. Her shoulders heaved as she wept, the the sound of her own voice alien and small. She was not just tired, she was undone. The door groaned on its hinges. A sliver of harsh, fluorescent light sliced through the darkness of the storage room, cutting across the floorboards. Astra did not look up. She kept her face pressed into her palms, her breath hitching as she braced for another demand, another expectation she could not meet. But no voice came. Only the soft, rhythmic sound of someone shifting weight. She squinted through the gaps in her fingers. Saul stood in the threshold, his frame silhouetted against the bright hallway. He did not move to touch her. He did not offer a hollow platitude or a frantic gesture of concern. He simply leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. His posture was a sharp, immovable anchor in the room. He watched her with a steady, unblinking focus that refused to acknowledge the panic as a catastrophe. He was a pillar of stillness, his presence occupying the space with a calm that felt almost heavy. Astra watched him, her own trembling slowing as she registered the lack of urgency in his stance. Sol shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He did not look away from her. "You did not go backward," he said, his voice cutting through the static in her head like a sharp blade. Astra flinched, her hands tightening against her face. She shook her head, the movement jagged and desperate. "It feels like failure, Saul. I am right back where I started," she countered, her voice thick with exhaustion. She expected him to offer comfort, to tell her it would be all right, but he remained motionless. "You went deeper," he continued, his tone devoid of pity. He spoke as if he were describing a map, not a person. Astra lowered her hands, her eyes red and searching his face for a sign of mockery, but found only a steady, unwavering resolve. She looked down at the dust on the floor. The room felt smaller, the air tighter. Yet for the first time, the panic did not feel like an end. Sol stepped into the room, the space shrinking as he moved. He pulled a wooden crate toward him and sat, his boots planted firmly on the concrete. He did not look for a way to pull her out of the dark. He looked at the walls, then back to her. "It is exposure," he said, his voice low and rhythmic. "You have reached a layer you could not see before. The old patterns are just surfacing to be cleared." He gestured to the floor, to the dust and the shadows. Astra watched him, her breath hitching as she tried to process the shift. To her, the crushing weight was a wall. To him, it was a threshold. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, creating a bridge between them. "You think this is a return to the start?" he continued. "But it is a return to the roots. These patterns have been buried under the surface for years, waiting for the right pressure to force them out." Astra felt the cold floor beneath her palms, the reality of the room anchoring her. She looked at her own hands, seeing the tension in her knuckles. And for the first time, she did not fight the sensation. Astra closed her eyes, shutting out the dim light of the storage room. She pressed her palms flat against the cold, gritty floor, feeling the texture of the concrete beneath her skin. The panic was still there, a jagged, pulsing rhythm behind her ribs, but she stopped trying to push it away. She took a breath, slow and deliberate, and imagined herself standing on a shoreline while the storm raged out at sea. The wind howled and the waves crashed, but she remained on the sand, watching the water rise and fall without letting it touch her. She focused on the sensation of her own heartbeat, counting the intervals between the thuds. It was a chaotic, violent rhythm, yet it was distinct from her. She was the observer, not the storm. She felt the tightness in her chest, the sharp, electric prickle of anxiety, and acknowledged each sensation as a passing wave. The panic did not vanish. It simply lost its power to dictate her reality. She sat in the center of the turbulence, anchored by the simple, undeniable fact of her own presence. She was still here. The storm was just a temporary weather pattern, and for the first time, she did not feel the need to run. Astra drew a long, measured breath, pulling the air deep into her lungs until her diaphragm expanded. She felt the rigid knot of tension at the base of her neck, a physical anchor of the panic, and consciously willed the muscles to slacken. It did not happen all at once. She exhaled slowly, a thin stream of air, and with every second of the count, the tightness began to lose its grip. The high-pitched drone that had been vibrating against her skull for the last hour started to waver. It dipped in frequency, losing its sharp, piercing edge. She focused entirely on the space between her breaths, the absolute stillness that existed before the next inhale. The walls of the storage room, which had felt like they were closing in, seemed to drift back to their original positions. The air grew lighter, losing its thick, suffocating quality. She kept her eyes closed, listening to the silence as it crept back into the room. The frantic, jagged rhythm of her pulse smoothed out, settling into a steady, rhythmic thrum. She was no longer fighting the current. She was floating above it. Astra opened her eyes. The dim light of the storage room no longer felt oppressive. It was simply space. She placed her hands on the floor, feeling the grit of dust against her palms, and pushed upward. Her muscles felt heavy, drained of the frantic energy that had fueled her earlier sprint, but they responded to her command. She rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached down to brush the fine gray dust from her legs, the friction of her palms against the fabric a sharp grounding sensation. The heavy, crushing pressure that usually clung to her for days was already thinning. It was dissolving, not into nothingness, but into a manageable, fading echo. She stood tall, testing her balance. The room remained still. The frantic, jagged pulse that had defined her morning had smoothed into a steady, quiet rhythm. She felt the lingering tension in her shoulders finally uncoil, leaving her frame light and alert. She was standing, she was present, and the storm had passed. Astra exhaled, the last remnants of the internal storm dissipating like mist in a breeze. She looked at Sol, who remained leaning against the doorframe, his presence a steady anchor in the small, quiet space. A faint, genuine smile touched her lips as she processed the speed of her own recovery. Sol pushed off the frame, his movements unhurried. "That is growth," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "It is not about avoiding the storm, but walking through it differently." Astra nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle. She realized the panic had not been regression, but a test of her new capacity. "I spent so long trying to outrun the pressure," she admitted, her voice steady. "I thought if I moved fast enough, I could leave it behind. But the speed was just another form of hiding." She took a step toward the exit, her posture relaxed, no longer bracing. She was no longer a victim of her own internal weather. She was the one navigating it. Astra turned her attention to the floor where the files lay scattered. They were just sheets of paper now, not the overwhelming demands that had triggered her collapse. She knelt, her movements fluid and unhurried. She picked up the first page, smoothing the corner with her thumb, feeling the texture of the grain beneath her skin. There was no rush. The urgency that had defined her morning had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, steady focus. She gathered the remaining documents into a neat stack, tapping the edges against the floor to align them perfectly. Each motion was intentional, a physical manifestation of her regained composure. She stood up, holding the files firmly against her side. The storage room felt small, almost insignificant, compared to the clarity she now possessed. She walked toward the door, her steps measured and rhythmic. She did not check her watch. She did not scan the hallway for incoming emails. She simply occupied the space she was in, fully present. As she stepped out into the wider office corridor, she looked ahead. The path was clear, the air was still, and the frantic noise of the day had finally fallen silent. Astra stood in the center of the corridor, the weight of the files in her hands feeling balanced and light. She looked down at the paper, then out toward the vast, open office space. The shadows that had once seemed like looming threats now appeared as simple contours of the environment, features she had learned to navigate. She realized the panic had not been a detour, but a necessary descent into the depths of her own resilience. "So even falling," she said, "is part of rising." The words hung in the air, stripping away the last remnants of her self-doubt. She felt the shift in her own perspective. Every stumble, every moment of breathlessness, had served to refine her understanding. She was using gravity to propel her forward. She looked ahead, seeing the path not as a race to be won, but as a journey to be mastered, one deliberate step at a time. The office lights flickered once, then dimmed, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. Astra did not flinch. She adjusted her grip on the files, feeling the solid weight of the paper against her palm. The high-pitched drone was gone. She turned toward the exit, her posture upright and relaxed. Every step she took was deliberate, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing. She passed the desks she had once sprinted by, but now she moved with the ease of someone who owned her own time. She reached the main doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the cooling air of the evening. The transition was seamless. With a final, steady breath, she walked into the distance, the sound of her footsteps fading into the quiet of the night.